One thing you may have noticed about ideologues is that they never give you a straight answer. They can't define what they mean, they can't give you anything concrete to work with, it's always vague pie-in-the-sky ideas. These ideas may seem lovely on the surface, but if you think about them for more than about 2 seconds, they have no substance. Socialism is when the workers live in a classless, commodityless, moneyless society. Okay, food is a commodity, so if there's no commodities, there's no food, and we all starve to death. Of course, they'll respond with, well, that's not what we mean is this other thing which is equally flawed and nonsensical, and they can never define it. Socialism isn't when the state does stuff. Okay, so how do we get to this wonderful commune of yours? Do we sit around the campfire singing Cumbia Army Marx, and then puppy dogs and rainbows happen? No, we use the totalitarian state to implement the regime. Of course, they'll then say, it's not that, it's something else, and once again, you'll never get a straight answer. And I'm sure many of you know exactly what I mean. If you've ever had a conversation with any of these people, you'll probably be as frustrated as I am when you're facing this dishonest tactic. And it was only recently that I realised why they were doing this, where this comes from. It's not accidental, it's by design. And even they themselves don't even realise the origin of this. Some of them definitely do, but I suspect many do not. So I don't know if anyone has ever pointed this out before, but I'm going to explain to you today why the Marxists, fascists, National Socialists, and socialists in general can never define anything, never give you a straight answer, never give you concrete policies, live by their emotions, and they have an inability to talk in normal everyday language with you. It's not accidental, it's by design. And it's mainly thanks to Hegel, who we'll get to shortly. Let me give you an example. Giovanni Gentile was the philosophical founder of fascism, the original Italian version. Fascism had 3 components: nationalism, syndicalism, and a philosophy he called actualism, but which is now known as actual idealism. Here is the Wikipedia page on actual idealism. Let's just read the first sentence. Actual idealism was a form of idealism developed by Giovanni Gentile that grew into a grounded idealism, contrasting the transcendental idealism of Immanuel Kant and the absolute idealism of Hegel. Okay, sounds like gibberish, right? Well, that's because it is. What's important here is that Gentile is getting his ideas from Kant and Hegel, although Wikipedia technically doesn't say this, but he is. So let me read you a bit more, and during this reading, if it makes 0 sense to you, that's because it's pure ideobabble. It's deliberately designed to be unintelligible to anyone who isn't part of the cult. So you're not stupid, it is total gibberish. But I'm going to read it to you anyway so that you have a clear example of what ideobabble looks like. To Gentile, who considered himself the philosopher of fascism, while simultaneously describing himself as liberal and socialist, actualism was presented the sole remedy to philosophically preserving free agency by making the act of thinking self-creative, and therefore without any contingency and not in the potency of any other fact. Actual idealism holds that it is the act of thinking as perception, not creative thought as imagination, which defines reality. Therefore, one idea or another can only be a formulation of particulars within the bounds of a known totality, in which one idea is not on any side of those particulars. Totality, constituting the whole cohesive reality, is negated in such idea by itself. Integration of totality against idea in appealing to oneself is the sole fruitful means of idea, which poses no favoritism to the developed ideas, giving a knowing precedence to the world it has created into itself. Anything less is a presupposition and therefore innately unreal. This totality is the act of thinking, not thought so regarded by thinking. Did you get that? You thought fascism was just thugs and stuff, but clearly it's not. I could quote from Karl Marx or Stalin or anyone else, but if you've ever read any of them, you know full well it's just more of this idiobabble. And they're getting this stuff from Hegel. Now, here's what I realised recently. In normal speech, like what I'm doing with you now, we deal with concretes, the essence of something. If I said to you, that four-legged furry thing which barks is a dog, you'd know exactly what I'm talking about. We teach kids words that correspond to a concrete essence of something because that's how humans learn. If we didn't have a word for something, we can invent a word. Idiobabble is just a word I invented. The title of this video is the first time anyone has ever seen that word. It's never been used before. Yeah, I've used it in the title, and I used it a couple of times in this video so far, and you perceived it, you knew what it meant, even though I haven't yet defined it. But you have a sense of what it does mean. In a nutshell, it means ideological jargon. And I'm going to release a separate video shortly after this one where I provide a full definition of the word idiobabble plus examples, because I think it'll be a very useful word for us to use to call these people out, like Gentile, who ramble on nonsensically about stuff that is, at its heart, completely detached from reality. But the point is that we live in an objective world, and we talk in concretes. The purpose of language is to communicate, not to obfuscate, make things unclear or hard to understand. But that's not how the ideologues think. The clue is in the name, ideology. They live for the idea, the abstract. They are not tethered to reality. They reject reality. They're living in the clouds, and they are deliberately refusing to talk in concretes. That's why they don't define anything. That's why they'll wriggle out of a conversation. That's why you can't read Karl Marx or Hegel or Gentile without wondering what on earth they're droning on about. But the question is, why? On the one hand, there's some practical reasons for why they're doing this. They've got to pretend that they're better than you. They're pretending that they're smarter than you. They're morally superior to you. You're just living in the material world while they're living in a spiritual higher plane of existence. It gives them a feeling of worth, because in reality they're worthless. They're poor and they've done nothing with their lives. They are lazy and delusional. And this ties into the next practical reason. It's a way of justifying to themselves that they're entitled to other people's money. They say, you're just obsessed with base materialistic things. You've got to contribute to society. Translation, you have stuff, I need stuff, give me your stuff. But aside from the practical reasons, there is a deeper philosophical reason for this, which, if you understand it, puts all the pieces of the puzzle together. It perfectly explains why they are not able to give you concrete policies or definitions. It's deliberate. And this is where we get to Hegel. Now, Hegel is getting his ideas from others before him, but socialism, Marxism, fascism, and National Socialism all get their ideas from Hegel. So if we understand Hegel, we're going to understand what's going on here. So today, I'm going to give you, as best as I can, because this is difficult, a layman's explanation of Hegel's idiobabble. At the very core of this, Hegel is trying to find a purpose and meaning for his life. But instead of taking responsibility and deciding a purpose and meaning for himself, he exported his purpose and meaning to an external entity, in this case, God. Hegel decided that he would prove that God exists, and therefore, if God exists, then Hegel's meaning and purpose in life would be to serve God. By doing this, Hegel made a circle. Hegel exists, therefore God exists. Therefore, Hegel has meaning and purpose in God, and God has meaning and purpose in Hegel. The eye with which God sees me is the same eye by which I see him. My eye and his eye are one and the same. In righteousness I am weighted in God, and he in me. If God did not exist, nor would I. If I did not exist, nor would he. But wait a second. Hegel doesn't exist. He's dead. Therefore, God doesn't exist either. Checkmate, Christianity. There's no possible way to argue against this one. Stupid numpty Hegel. Anyway, in order for God to know himself, he has to see himself from the point of view of someone else. So he creates mankind in order for mankind to look at God. Mankind's purpose, according to Hegel and the Hermeticists, is to act as a mirror
to reflect the image of God back at God. When all of mankind is united as one in one giant state, they become the mirror that reflects God. God will therefore see himself and become complete. Human self-reflection is the actualization of God. Actualization just means self-completion. And by the way, the word ideal is another word for God. So actualization is self-completion, and Gentile's actual idealism, therefore, means the self-completion of God. Fascism is, fundamentally, a religion that is trying to self-complete God. And it's based on what Hegel and the Hermeticists were writing about, as well as those that came before them.
Explaining this in normal English, Hegel thinks God created the universe, and specifically mankind, so that God could know himself. And Hegel believes that God can only see himself through the eyes of others. God can do anything, but he cannot see himself, apparently. So, if humans get to know God, and God knows humans, then God can know himself through the eyes of humanity. Humanity is the mirror that reflects God. This idea comes from a religious cult known as Hermeticism, and for the purpose of this video, we'll not get into it, but Hegel basically takes Hermeticism to the next level. So, Hegel wants to know God, and according to Hegel and the Hermeticists, humans are the only creatures that can know God. Why? Well, knowledge is a philosophical concept. The word wisdom comes from the ancient Greek word sophia, and is where we get the word philosophy from, philos sophia, philosophy, the love of knowledge. God wants to know himself, and therefore created humans, the Homo sapiens, the wise men. Humans are the wise men and can use wisdom, philosophy, to come to know God. Coming to know God via wisdom, theosophia, is where we get the term theosophy from. Helena Blavatsky's theosophy leads to National Socialism via Guido von List, and Blavatsky's getting her stuff from mainstream theosophy, which Jacob Boehme is a part of. And Hegel loves Boehme. It's from Boehme that we get the idea that God can't truly know himself without humanity. So there's a whole web of interconnected parts here. What's interesting about this is that Boehme says that nothing can truly know itself without opposition. God has to have man in order to know himself. But then this leaves open a gaping hole in the nonsense. Why doesn't God just create another God? Why doesn't God create a second absolute God like himself and just use that second God to see himself? Or why not create man, have him live in the Garden of Eden, and use man to see God that way? Why have man live in a harsh and unforgiving universe? Well, of course, Boehme's got an answer for that.
You see, when man was in the Garden of Eden, he was an unthinking being. Until he ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, man was ignorant. And because you can't have a knowledge of God while being ignorant, man was an unreflective being, and so God couldn't use him to see himself. Only wise men can be used to see God, which also means that Adam wasn't human, but we'll ignore that. Therefore, man had to suffer the fall and live in sin for God to know himself. Okay, but why then, if man has suffered the fall, does he not reflect God now? Well, Boehme said even after the fall, men were still not fully conscious. They only had a chance of consciousness when Christ came along, who revealed wisdom to men, even though we know philosophy was invented centuries before Christ, completely undermining Boehme's narrative, but again, we'll just ignore that. And apparently, the passion, death, and resurrection, the Trinity, was a teaching to man, showing man how to know God, and thus return to God. And in a nutshell, Hegel agrees with Boehme.
This is a very convoluted way of just saying God needs to use man as a mirror to reflect his own image upon. And the way man becomes that mirror is through wisdom. When man becomes wise, man completes himself, self-actualizes. And in doing so, because he's a reflection of God, God becomes self-completed too.
Hegel holds that God is in some sense completed or actualized through the intellectual activity of mankind. Philosophy is the final stage in the actualization of absolute spirit.
I'm sure all of you are keeping up with this. I'm certain none of you have just gone cross-eyed thinking about any of this, or got confused or whatever, so to summarise all that we've discussed so far in one simple, easy to understand sentence, man is the mirror of God, but he's not holding that mirror up properly yet. Hegel, though, will get man to hold up the mirror properly.
Now, to explain this fully, we need to go back to the ancient Greeks for a short while. The father of philosophy was Thales, and we only have 4 surviving sentences from him, so sucks to be him, I guess. Thales said that there was a stuff that made up everything, a world stuff, and he believed that this stuff that made up everything was water. By the way, if the world is made of solid water, in other words, ice, you get what's known as the world ice theory that Hitler subscribed to. And yes, ultimately this is where he's getting it from. The Welteislehre provided an Aryan alternative to the dreadful and mistaken Jewish theories of scientists like Einstein. Even the usually skeptical Hitler embraced glacial cosmogony. Well, Thales was shortly followed by Pythagoras, who you may have heard of. He was the one who discovered how to calculate the length of the hypotenuse of a right-angled triangle. Remember learning that one in school? You know, that super useful thing that we definitely use every single day. Stupid numpty Pythagoras.
Well, what you may not have known is that Pythagoras and his Pythagoreans were a bunch of mystic hippies who lived communistically without private property. Theirs was a religion called Orphism, a mystery cult from the Middle East. They believed that man had a lower body and a higher soul, and that the two were in conflict with each other. They said the soul is akin to God, but it sinned and fell from grace, and, as a punishment for this sin, it was imprisoned in the body on this earth. The body is therefore the prison, a tomb of the soul.
Their god was Dionysus. Man's soul was a fragment of Dionysus, and man's body was a heritage from the Titans. They said men's souls can escape this earth and reunite with God, Dionysus, achieving true happiness and salvation.
Salvation comes from freeing the divine from the bondage of the body, and if the soul is pure, it can escape the prison of the material world. They believed in the purification of the soul by living a pleasure-denying life. Doing this will allow you to get back home to the Garden of Eden. Except they didn't call it Eden. The idea that intercourse is bad or that money is the root of all evil comes from Orphism. And on top of this, they also said there were 2 different worlds. This world and the world of God, a supernatural realm.
This, historically and philosophically, is the primary source of the soul-body opposition in Western civilization.
And because Pythagoras himself was a good mathematician and scientist, the Orphic cult spread into Greece and had a major influence on the philosophers that came later. Now, this is me interpreting this or speculating, but I think the Greek philosophers believed in this second world of God idea first, and then tried to justify it with their philosophy. Nobody with half a brain is going to come to the conclusions they came to unless they were already believing in Orphism. So it seems fairly obvious that philosophy, from then to the modern day, has been corrupted by this Orphic religion, and this has had some major ramifications to the world that we live in.
So with this in mind, after Pythagoras we get Heraclitus. Heraclitus was obsessed with change, and believed change required the existence of contradictions, things that are and are not at the same time. Leonard Peikoff, in his History of Philosophy series, gives the example of a struck match. You have a match, you strike the match, and you end up with a different match at the end after it burns out. And if you think about it, it's the same match, but it's not the same match at the same time. A contradiction. Another example, you were a baby, but are you the same as that baby now? Heraclitus would say that you are the same and not the same at the same time. Again, a contradiction. Everything is water, but water changes, so it's not the same. Again, a contradiction. You can't step into the same river twice, for fresh waters are always flowing in. I'm sorry, I've just got to point this out. A river is defined as a stream of flowing water. If the water was standing still, it wouldn't be a river, would it? So yes, you may not be in the exact same water, but you are in the same river. This should have been obvious to the ancient Greeks, but apparently not.
So, Heraclitus said that change is everything, and nothing remains the same. So, change requires a contradiction. And the world is constantly changing, therefore, the world is made up of contradictions. And despite the fact that this is not true, yes, things change, but there is no contradiction in that, Heraclitus has had a profound impact on history. Heraclitus said that the essence of reality was change itself, or becoming, as he put it. Change is not only the destruction of something previous, it's the beginning of something new. This is where the German word aufheben comes from, to abolish and to transcend at the same time, in other words, change. Hegel loved the word aufheben, as did Marx, and ultimately this is where historical materialism comes from. The idea of the revolution, and the idea of progress in the modern leftist sense, or action from the fascists, comes from Heraclitus' idea of the world in constant change.
Life consists precisely and primarily in this, that a being is at each moment itself and yet something else. Life is therefore also a contradiction, which is present in things and processes themselves, and which constantly originates and resolves itself. And as soon as the contradiction ceases, life too comes to an end, and death steps in.
As another revolutionary, Hitler described change, or struggle as he put it, as the father of all things, which was inspired by Heraclitus. Hitler believed that there was no life without struggle change, and that the world was also in perpetual struggle change. And he wasn't the only one. The fascist concept of action, as Mosley put it, or dynamism, as Gentili put it, comes from the Heraclitean concept of change. Gentili refers to Epicurus in the Origins and Doctrine of Fascism, who was a later Greek philosopher whose ideas have their origins in Heraclitus.
Revolutions, if they are genuine, do not stop at anything. Revolutions are breakthroughs of a new Weltanschauung worldview.
They often say that Marxism, fascism and so on are not definable. They have no concrete policies. Not only is this by design, that's the point. Heraclitus said the world is in constant change. These movements are based on this orphic cult idea of change. They have no substance. They are change in and of itself. They are progress. They are action. They are dynamism. They are non-concrete. They are abstract movements change. Hitler kept going on and on about how National Socialism wasn't a party, it was a movement. It had no real concrete goals or policies because it was the concept of change itself. Same with the Marxists, same with the Socialists and the Fascists. It's a constant wheel of motion, a revolution, a snake eating its own tail. That's why it's so hard to precisely define them, because the only thing that they really embody is change itself. Now, what Heraclitus also said was something completely stupid, as if what we just said so far isn't stupid anyway. He said that because everything is in constant change, nothing is really real. No object or thing is truly that object or thing, because everything was constantly changing. This is what the modern dialectical materialists say. The subatomic particles are all flying around and changing all the time, so therefore nothing is really real. They also argue that space exists between the particles, proving that nothing is really solid. So there are no tables and mountains and plants or whatever. There are no entities because everything is in constant change, which means nothing can exist.
Nothing is. Everything is becoming.
Now, obviously, anyone who's got a brain will quickly realise that something is wrong with this conclusion. Why? Because things do actually exist. Atoms may be mostly space, but you try walking through a wall, you'll quickly realise that you're solid. And you do exist. You don't not exist. If you did not exist, where would your consciousness come from? The fact that you have a consciousness proves that you do exist. However, Heraclitus thought of that. You see, what Heraclitus then says is that because this reality is not real, there must be a second reality. He says there are two realms, the realm of appearance, this one, and the realm of reality, the other one, which isn't real. This second realm is the one that's really real, he said, and is known by reason alone, because it doesn't really exist. Whoops, that's me interjecting. You see, you thought that because your mind exists, that you exist too. But no, you don't. The existence of your mind proves that this other second reality really exists, and that's where your mind actually lives, in this second reality. Yeah, and Heraclitus was a respected philosopher, and most of philosophy is built upon this principle, completely undermining the idea that philosophy is a legitimate subject. But hey, at least you know that the ancient Orphic cult is still alive and kicking. Yay. And I want to make this clear if it wasn't already. In order for you to fall for a cult, you have to close your mind to reason. If they can get you to reject reason, they can get you to reject reality. If you reject reality, they can get you to believe whatever they want, at which point you'll put the money in the hat. That's what this is all about.
I have, therefore, found it necessary to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. Kant also found it necessary to deny happiness in order to make room for duty. The essence of moral virtue, he says, is selflessness. Selfless, lifelong obedience to duty without any expectation of reward, and regardless of how much it might make one suffer. In all cults, there is an ongoing, subtle undermining of self-esteem.
Who are you dutifully bound to serve? The priest. Where do all the fruits of your labour go? The cult. And if you try to think for yourself, or question things, or expect better treatment, then you're shamed for it. Being accused of selfishness is the worst thing imaginable for so many people who haven't yet realised that they've completely lost frame. They're no longer in control of their own lives because someone else has used magic words to take control of them. All this comes down to is the fact that a bunch of narcissists are using controlling and coercive tactics to manipulate you into doing what benefits them. And worse, the victims will even defend these creatures.
Deprogramming is providing members with the information about the cult and showing them how their own decision-making power has been taken away from them. Cults employ secretiveness because most people would otherwise not knowingly affiliate with them. Neither intelligence nor family background precludes being tricked and caught by a cult. People who have been caught weren't necessarily seeking or looking for something. Cults target the elderly in nursing homes after volunteering, or children. They will go to hospitals to prey upon people there.
Some cults are based on yoga or therapy, and Ross in the book Cults Inside Out even says some cults are based on philosophy. And I agree with him. 99% of all philosophy subscribes to cultish beliefs. This is because of that Orphic influence which has trickled down through the ages from philosopher after philosopher. You see, after Heraclitus, we get Socrates and Plato, both of whom were also influenced by the same ideas.
When we get to Plato, this second mind reality of Heraclitus gets turned into Plato's world of forms. If you've ever heard of Plato's cave, this is what it's about. We're all in this cave watching the shadows on the wall, and what we need to do is realise that we're living in a fake reality, and then come out of the cave into the real world. So, how do we come out of the Matrix?
Well, Plato basically said that everything was split into two worlds: concrete, material things, and abstract concepts, forms. The technical terms were particulars and universals, but I'm just going to refer to them as material and forms from now on. Plato said forms, concepts of the mind, are never changing, whereas concrete material things are. Therefore, the world of forms is the real world, and the material world is just a reflection of this true reality. And to explain this, Plato created a story about a great craftsman, an artisan, a great architect of the universe, as the Masons call him, a demiurgus from the Greek, a god that produced the material world. In fact, Plato's demiurgos is the ancestor of the Christian God. But it's worth noting that the demiurge is not the creator of the world of forms. He just creates the imperfect material world by looking at the perfect world of forms and taking that as inspiration. So there is a difference. So then you might ask, what creates the world of forms? Well, Plato says it's the ultimate form, which he calls the form of the good. The form of the good is there at the top of the pyramid, and from that everything else is created, starting with the heavens and then the demiurgos, and from that to the material world, roughly speaking. Plato then decided that it's not possible for humans to grasp God, the form of the good. He said in order to grasp gnosis, the form of the good, you must transcend the intellect and have a vision, a revelation. And Leonard Peikoff says that this is what we call mysticism, the view that knowledge isn't gained by perception but is obtainable by spirituality. Plato, therefore, is the father of mysticism in Western philosophy, and it's from him and Heraclitus that the cult belief system seeped into the modern world. With this knowledge of what the ancient Greeks thought, we can now see where Boomer, and therefore Hegel, are coming from. So, let's just quickly recap. Hegel thought God needed to use man as a mirror to reflect his own image upon. And the way man becomes that mirror is through wisdom, philosophy. He said, when man becomes wise, he completes himself, and in doing so, God becomes complete too. And since God created the material world, and the material world is full of contradictions, thanks to change, it stands to reason that in order to become the mirror to God, we have to get over the contradictions. The contradictions keep us in the material realm, and we want to transcend the material realm in our minds in order to be a reflection for God. So, how do we transcend the material realm? Through the magic words of the dialectic, which comes from the Hermes cult. The dialectic is a magic spell that allows us to overcome the contradictions and become God's reflection. The word dialectic just means to discuss or debate. I told you history theory is influenced by the cult. But don't let the name fool you. Hegel refers to this as a system of circles which aligns with traditional Hermeticism. But in reality, it's a system of triads. A triad is a union of three, otherwise known as a trinity. This is not a coincidence. Hegel structured his entire philosophy around the Christian Trinity, Father, Son and Holy Spirit, and that's where the 3 points of his dialectic come from. Eagle-eyed viewers who watched my previous video on the real religion behind National Socialism may have noticed that Hegel was inspired by the works of Joachim of Fiore, who also used the Trinity to predict the Third Age that would start in 1260. This is true, but unfortunately a critic of mine said that because I didn't explain to you how Joachim calculated the date 1260, this means I'm wrong. I also didn't explain what Joachim had for breakfast, or what his favourite colour was, so I clearly have zero clue about this subject. I mean, if I can't explain to you why Christ returned in 1260 to reign for 1,000 years, spoiler alert, right? Christ did return in 1260 apparently. I know, I was shocked when I found this out as well. You know, apparently he's still ruling right now. If I can't explain this, then how on a fake material earth can anyone take me seriously? So let me quickly explain to you, Mr. YouTube critic, who lied and said I said a bunch of stuff I didn't actually say, to your viewers, knowing full well that they haven't watched any of my videos and therefore wouldn't know what I did or didn't say. Let me explain to you how Joachim got the date 1260. Joachim got the date 1260 because your mama. So anyway, let's get back to reality and explain the dialectic as Hegel used it. We have two opposite things, a contradiction. Normal people would say that we can't have a contradiction, therefore one or both of these opposites must be wrong. We therefore dismiss the one that's wrong, or both, and find the truth. But you see, according to Hegel and the Hermeticists, this logic is a trap. Identifying contradictions and then getting rid of one or the other to find the truth keeps us in the material world. So logic is bad, apparently. And the Hermeticist solution was different. Rather than getting rid of one or the other, Hegel said, change, or Aufheben, results in a synthesis of the opposites. The two opposites become reconciled, and thus contradictions are good. This triangular method that Hegel used has often been referred to as thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. The problem is that the third term, synthesis, is not ideal for describing Hegel, and will lead to criticism if I don't point this out. So I'm using the term reconciled as McGee does in the book Hegel and the Hermetic Tradition, whilst also pointing out that using the word synthesis on the test gets you lousy marks, unless you use it when referring to the Nazis.
The life of a race and of a people is a mystical synthesis, a manifestation of the soul, which cannot be explained by the logic of reason nor by casual analysis.
But what are we doing when we do the dialectic? We are reconciling the two opposites into a new third position. So then we have a new position, which will also have an opposite. This then gets reconciled again into a new third position, right? And so on, and up, and up, and up, and up, and up, off the screen, until we get to God. Therefore, using the dialectic, we can transcend this fake reality that we're all trapped in. So, in the most basic language that I can come up with so that everyone can understand this, the idea of dialectical materialism is defined as the transcendence of a fake material reality. That's literally the definition. Dialectical materialism, the transcendence of a fake material reality. I should point out here that we don't live in a material reality. We live in an objective reality, and those are not the same thing. There is no second orphic reality that we must transcend to. Also, Hegel is not trying to physically transcend, I don't think. It looks like he was just trying to transcend his mind to God. And Marx's dialectical materialism was different to Hegel's. It's mostly the same, except he claimed it was the opposite, because everything Marx said is definitely true, just like he said that the capitalists were the Jews, and that's why he hated them so much.
My dialectic method is not only different from the Hegelian, but is its direct opposite. To Hegel, the life process of the human brain, i.e. the process of thinking, which under the name of the idea he even transforms into an independent subject, is the demiurgus of the real world. And the real world is only the external phenomenal form of the idea. With me, on the contrary, the ideal is nothing else than the material world reflected by the human mind and translated into forms of thought. Did you understand that? No? Oh well, that's because you're stupid. It's not because Karl Marx wrote a load of gibberish nonsense. No, it's not that at all. It's definitely not ideobabble. So yeah, put the money in the hat, comrade.
But anyway, there's another thing we need to understand here. Think about it. If we have something in the material realm, Heraclitus said there is always an opposite. There's always a contradiction to overcome. But what happens when we get to God? We have God, and therefore we have not God. If there is a God, the opposite is that there is no God. Therefore, we have a contradiction which must be overcome. So, we go higher than God. Now, obviously, God is meant to be the last step, but he actually isn't. He can't be. According to the dialectic, there must be another God of some kind above God. And if that God exists, then there must be a not that God as well, which means we have another Aufheben. And we go up, and it never stops. It just goes all the way to infinity and beyond. Another way to think about this. If God can do anything, can he not exist? Yes, because he's God and can do anything. So there's a contradiction, which means we've got a problem. Now, normal Christians would probably just play the faith card. It doesn't matter if the idea of God is a contradiction, I believe in him anyway. Hegel can't do this because it self-refutes the beloved dialectic. The dialectic is self-refuting in and of itself, so what is his solution? His solution is to cheat. He doesn't actually tell you what God is, because as soon as you name God, or define God, God is self-refuted by the dialectic. So what he does is he gets as close to God as possible without actually naming God. So like a PUBG match, the circle gets closer and closer and closer until there's only one man left standing, and that man is God. And thus, Hegel proves that God exists. I mean, he's not actually proven anything, but he thinks that he has.
Hegel rejects propositional thought, which would define the absolute, and instead talks around, or thinks around, the absolute, revealing at each point some aspect or part of it. And he's not the only one to do this, by the way. This might be where the idea comes from that you're not allowed to say God's real name. It's not about respect as such, it's because doing so makes God concrete, which then means there's an opposite, and therefore God wouldn't be the real God. That might explain the origin of this don't say God's real name idea.
But it gets worse. So, using the dialectic, Hegel thinks he's found God in the centre of the PUBG circle. But if you think about it, God is everything and nothing at the same time, right? Thanks to Heraclitus' change, God is a walking contradiction. And as we discussed earlier, man's purpose is to gain wisdom, philosophy, which will allow him to reflect God. Therefore, in order for Hegel to become God's mirror, Hegel must have the mind of God. And remember, God is everything and nothing at the same time, so Hegel's mind must be everything and nothing at the same time. In other words, just like me when I was researching this nonsense, Hegel has to destroy his own mind. At least the conscious part. Now, there's a whole philosophical reason for this, which I don't really want to bore you with here. It's basically to do with the idea that concepts are already in the mind, and through self-reflection we can come to uncover those concepts which were created in the world of forms. It's just not worth getting into. But Hegel's hope is that if he destroys the conscious part of his brain, he will become unconscious, and thus closer to God. It's sort of like, if we go back to the Garden of Eden before the fall, we'll be with God, because God was in the Garden of Eden. This is the religious reason why Hitler, Marx, and the fascists strive for unthinking obedience. They want a new man that relies on unthinking instinct, action for the sake of action, and a shackling to some divine duty. They are trying to destroy man's consciousness in order to return to a more animalistic unconsciousness, and thus form an unthinking unity with God. This is precisely how the cult leaders control the flock. Coercive persuasion or thought reform leads to the breakdown of critical and independent thinking. It also causes those affected to become increasingly dependent on the group and its leadership to make value judgments for them, provide analysis, and in some situations determine the perimeters of reality. Whoa, nothing is really real, man. Trust me, bro. Karl Marx said the atoms are all space, man. Stupid numpty dialectical materialists. Perhaps the most effective and most characteristic method of domination employed by National Socialism, the marching. At first, this marching seemed to be a curious whim of the National Socialists. These eternal night marches, this keeping of the whole population on the march, seemed to be a senseless waste of time and energy. Only much later was there revealed in it a subtle intention based on a well-judged adjustment of ends and means. Marching diverts men's thoughts. Marching kills thought. Marching makes an end of individuality. Marching is the indispensable magic stroke performed in order to accustom the people to a mechanical quasi-ritualistic activity until it becomes second nature. No less an authority than the pseudo-German Rosenberg in his Gestaltung der Idee has given the classic explanation of this occupation with marching. The German nation is simply out to discover at last its own style of living, a style of living that is fundamentally distinguished from what is called British liberalism. It is the style of a marching column, no matter where or to what end this marching column may be directed. At the back of all these night marches, marches out, marches back, these mass demonstrations and parades, was the consideration that the sense of primitive community through functional integration is created and fostered by marching in columns, military drill, military evolutions, the rhythm of a host in step. Nothing could show more shockingly, more grimly, and indeed spectrally, the utter emptiness of a political movement and its concentration on mere externals than this elevation of marching to be its motto and essential principle. We have it here, admitted by Alfred Rosenberg, that the nation is marching aimlessly, just for the sake of marching. It is a confession of the lack of any sort of doctrine in this revolution for revolution's sake, this hustling activity just to distract men's minds. But remember before when I said that in order for you to fall for a cult, you have to close your mind to reason. If they can get you to reject reason, they can get you to reject reality. If you reject reality, they can get you to believe whatever they want, at which point you'll put the money in the hat. Well again, Ross from Cults Inside and Out says this.
Destructive cult leaders are frequently consumed with messianic visions and grandiose ideas about changing the world to suit their own purposes. Some have claimed to be an exclusive vehicle for enlightenment chosen by some higher power, a supposed psychic connected to historical figures, or even aliens from outer space. Well, that to me sounds like every Marxist in existence. And what was it that Hegel said? Hegel is not a philosopher. He is no lover or seeker of wisdom. He believes he has found it. To help bring philosophy closer to the form of science, to the goal where it can lay aside the title of love of knowing and be actual knowledge, that is what I have set before me. By the end of the Phenomenology, Hegel claims to have arrived at absolute knowledge, which he identifies with wisdom.
Hegel is literally the definition of a cult leader. And this means that those who followed Hegel, whether they took some bits out or swapped things around, were doing the exact same thing. Karl Marx, Giovanni Gentile, Lenin, Julius Evola, Mr. Hitler, etc., etc. They're all cult leaders. Stalin even wrote a book on dialectical materialism in 1938.
Dialectical materialism is the world outlook of the Marxist-Leninist Party. It is called dialectical materialism because its approach to the phenomena of nature, its method of studying and apprehending them, is dialectical, while its interpretation of the phenomena of nature, its conception of these phenomena, its theory, is materialistic.
And just like Hegel, now we circle back round to the beginning of the video. This is the reason why the ideologues cannot give you a straight answer. To name something is to make it concrete. If it's concrete, it's no longer magical. It's material. The socialists cannot define what socialism is because socialism is a magical word that means whatever people want it to mean. Socialism is when the workers are rich, when puppy dogs and rainbows happen, when you score a natural 20 in Dungeons and Dragons. It's nothing and everything at the same time. As soon as you define socialism, it's no longer God. So long as they never say what goddess socialism is, goddess socialism can be anything and everything to anybody. They have no policies, just vague, sweeping promises that have no basis in reality. Same with fascism, same with Marxism, same with any of these ideologies. As soon as they give you something concrete, it destroys itself. It's a magic trick. It has to remain as a pie-in-the-sky idea and not be defined in order for it to be effective. If you define it, it becomes material, and they are against materialism because they're all about magic. This also goes in line with their dialectic materialism. God is a magical abstract, therefore everything they say must remain a magical abstract. That's why they can't give you a straight answer, can't define what they mean, can't give you anything concrete. They wriggle and squirm out of arguments they don't like. They won't accept material evidence because materialism is bad. It's not real, guys. Everything can be changed and distorted to suit their agenda. Their writings can remain convoluted, nonsensical gibberish because they've destroyed the conscious part of their minds. It all aligns. They are a cult. It's all nonsense. Do not fall for the idiobabble. They are out to destroy your mind so that you put the money in the hat. The followers are delusional. A lot of them are mentally ill and openly admit it. And I don't know what the solution is. But I'm hoping that I can at least stop some of you from falling for their tricks. If you are thinking for yourself, putting yourself first and grounding yourself in objective reality, then you're unlikely to fall for their magic. And if you want the method of knowing what really is the case, a way of discovering what the truth actually is, check out my video, But How Do You Know You're Right, where I outline the method that will ground you in objective reality and shield you from the sorcerers. Thanks for watching, bye for now.